Hello, my name's Laura Dickinson and I work at Girls Not Brides. We face this issue all the time, you know, talking about child marriage and keeping this as a relevant issue in the media all the time. The request that we get all the time from a journalist is, can I speak to a child bride, preferably live and in 2 hours' time? So, you know, it's how... But understanding of their need to keep the issue relevant and newsworthy. And, you know, what's the right balance? It's the holy grail, but how do we get there?
Yep. Thank you. Mark.
Hi, Mark Galloway from IBT, the International Broadcasting Trust. Can I just say, fantastic panel. I was going to say, but I don't know if it's PC. It's just nice to listen to a panel that's all women. But am I still allowed to say that?
Nice to have some men talking about this topic as well.
All the men turned us down. Too much of a women's position.
Can I pick up something Caroline said about, because it's very striking here, we've got BBC Media Action and Plan. So we've got an organisation that specialises in media and one that works in the development field, collaborating and working together. We a few months ago published a report on HIV and stigma and the role of the media in challenging stigma, and we found that the role of NGOs in their interactions with media were a part of the problem. There were the specialist development media organisations like yours, BBC Media Action, but the knowledge and intelligence wasn't really being shared. So I wonder if you've got any reflections on how NGOs could be more effective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anyone else? I do have one online actually, which is basically from Layla in Cambridge, a freelance child and youth rights consultant. What more can we do to bring adults on board with a youth agenda when we know this takes time, effort and resources? Do you want to, Caroline, just pick up on this point about Mark's point about the NGOs first, and what more NGOs can do to progress this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the strategies that we use often in our interventions is, you know, as BBC Media Action, you'd expect us to largely be working with other media actors, but we do also form partnerships with local NGOs, and it's often we can play a role in bridging the gap between local NGOs and local media, and helping those two kind of sets of stakeholders form relationships with each other, not you know, training local NGOs to portray a certain message, but actually just building up that contacts base and helping local media. Often local media don't know where to go in terms of sort of finding contacts who are able to speak on certain issues. So I think that there does need to be sort of more proactive work done to bridge that gap, and that should be a key part of Media for Development projects, rather than just having that media to media interface. I think it's really important.
Sharon, some reflections?
Yeah, I've been thinking about several of the things that have been said, and I think one of the big issues, I mean, I think the point that was made over there about the fact that you do get a phone call that says, I want to talk to somebody who's been raped, so can it be tomorrow? It's that sort of story, and that is really difficult, because, you know, that's just unacceptable. But I think with NGOs, I think what they need to think about a bit more, and because I've done both sides, is not just constantly thinking about case studies and stories, which I know the media want, but also thinking much more, as somebody said, about structures, about the political environment. And we did some research this year in West Africa, and one of their key recommendations was the point that you made, which was working with grassroots activists, whether it's young women's organisations or women's organisations, working a bit more with troublemakers in order to upset things, whereas NGOs tend not to do that. They empower girls, and we've had a lot of times where I was talking to one of my colleagues who works in India, she's had these wonderful media projects where the girls have gone out and they've made films, they've challenged their communities. They get to 18 and they're no longer part of plans programs because they're adults. They go back into the community, and it's really difficult to know where they take this new knowledge and skills, because the options there aren't the jobs, and the option will be, okay, they didn't get married at 15, but they'll probably, and the frustration around all that. It's just really difficult, and it's that business of how, and it's not necessarily the job of an NGO to tackle structures, but I think to be a bit braver in coming out and not just looking at the programmers, but looking at the environment in which they're received, and okay, is this going to work or not, and how can we be a bit bolder and a bit broader? I mean, I'm not necessarily talking for my organisation, but I feel quite strongly about it, because the more I look at it, the more I think that the empowerment word is a bit of a
practically speaking, in relation to this topic, does that mean, as you were saying earlier, you have to engage with the media structures around this to get more positive representation of girls, and get the buy-in of editors, rather than dealing with the news desk?
You have to tackle some of the underlying attitudes a bit more, so that those sorts of things start, because the media doesn't just create, it reflects, and I think that's part of the problem. The media, it's not, the reason that they have all this stuff is because people are interested in it, or because, I mean, when I was in the media, it was, okay, how's it going to sell? How are people going to be interested? So I think it's a really difficult problem, and it goes beyond dealing with media. It goes to all our relationships with the societies that we live in ourselves, and how all that works. And it's a real struggle, and I found over the last year feeling more and more depressed about how things can change, because it's not just tackling news desks, it's a lot more difficult than that, I think.
I just also wanted to say, I think one of the challenges can be when we're just lobbying local media on a single issue, whereas actually you might want to take a step back and support local media to understand more about public service values, what their role in a society is more broadly, and shifts can be brought around at that level. I think maybe more effectively, working with local media to sort of cover more socially relevant stories, rather than sort of lobbying them on a single cause issue, which they might not see as being their job.
That's where drama can be perhaps a bit more subtle than news, if you like, that working with that sort of side of the media in a better way, and working together more, I think we can get a bit competitive, and that's completely unnecessary.
Eliza, just thinking about that question about that newsworthiness, and something you touched on,
Yeah, I mean, I think, the truth is, if we're talking about news journalism, whether it is about coming from the north, or you hear this all the time. Oh, I'm from Liverpool. The way the news is the reflection of Liverpool isn't accurate. Or I'm from Cameroon. Cameroon isn't portrayed the way I would like it in the media. News media has a very short attention span. It goes for something very specific. So I don't know if that is what you want to necessarily change, but actually, to the recognition that now, especially with new media, there's so many outlets for a story. So you don't have to, actually now, if you are able to and have, the capability within your comms team, you can do your own thing and let the media come to you, in the sense that build your own campaign, disseminate it, get your community behind it. That's what we see when we look at some of the recent campaigns, like Ice Bucket Challenge or whatever, that organizations haven't gone to the media and said, do you care about this issue, please write a story. Instead, they have tried to start something that's a grassroots movement, and when it catches on, I think someone said this earlier, when something takes off on social media, traditional media will pick it up. And so it's about just being a bit more creative in what you do. It's about digital storytelling, it's about doing documentaries online and creating, because now, as we increasingly see, NGOs are not just trying to get stories out there. NGOs can be media producers as well, and it's about taking that bull by the horns a bit more. But I think that while we're talking about this, we shouldn't forget that this is all about changing very embedded issues. So it will be long term, however way we look at it. And I think that whether it's because of NGO funding models or the pace of news, we're always thinking very short term and very immediate. But if we either want to change the structure for girls' lives or change what a newsroom looks like, these things are going to take time. And so it's only a game for those who are in it for the long haul. I think if you're not, then it will be quite frustrating, because these are deep-rooted issues that need changing. Lastly, I think one practical thing to think about is find a gatekeeper. Again, this is the long haul. But if you identify someone within a media organization who you can strike up a conversation with. When I was preparing for this talk, I saw that The Guardian had started Maggie O'Kane at The Guardian had started thinking and looking at FGM in 2012. We didn't do a campaign, the all-out FGM campaign, until this year. That means that some person or some organization has been working with this woman over a 2-year period, taking her to projects, showing her, because And then there was a campaign. And I think if you look at the big media organizations where it's increasingly competitive, they want to win awards, they want to do something that sets them out from the crowd, they need NGOs, they need organizations like you, but they won't write that story tomorrow. It might be a slow build. And so find that gatekeeper, find that Maggie O'Kane, and get them to buy into your work. And maybe in 2 years' time, you'll have a campaign under your belt and a cause that you can be proud of.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, Caroline, this question of adults buying in, being brought into, the campaigns. In the survey that you did, how much were adults, men being brought in as part of the campaigns?
I think quite a lot, because a lot of it was kind of family-oriented radio dramas or TV dramas that were open to everybody to watch, and so they were being watched in families or listened to in families by everybody. Unfortunately, the evaluations we looked at didn't go into enough detail, but I didn't at all get the sense that there was any kind of watershedding around what could and couldn't be discussed in these things we looked at. And I think that's partly because they were mostly development sector interventions that had been broadcast or on TV. They weren't mostly commercial TV or commercial media activities where there might have been some more of that, sort of thinking about what's appropriate to have where. So yes, I think that gatekeepers were being reached by that, and that was really clear, for example, in the Fataki example, in the Mina example, where there was evidence of parents and grandparents changing how they behaved. One of the ones we looked at was a series of short films in the Democratic Republic of Congo that was specifically targeted at men, and it showed men in modelling different kinds of gender, egalitarian behaviour. They had a set of scenarios, and so a job interview and a sexual harassment scenario, and sort of provided a script of an appropriate way to behave. They had another scenario of a soldier meeting a young woman, and he's out on his own. Instead of raping her, you can help her get back. She's run out of money, go help her get home. Or your daughter's failing at school. What do you do? Do you pull her out and get her married, or do you find a way to support her to get some remedial classes or get some help so that she can carry on? So I think there were quite a few examples, but I think it's all quite isolated. I think the question of how that plays out in more commercial media is one that would be very interesting to look at. Also, in the more kind of community-based type activities we looked at, there was an interesting example of people pledging to undertake certain behaviours and then pledging that they would then talk to 10 of their friends about it and trying to get them to change as well. And that seemed to me to possibly be a fruitful way to get adults on board with youth agendas. There's a lot of evidence that when people publicly pledge to do something among people that they care about, then they're quite embarrassed if they don't do that thing. And that's been applied all over the world around things like healthy eating and smoking and things like that. But it's also starting to be applied in things like gender-based violence and sending your daughter to school and stuff like that too.
Caroline, just quickly, I wonder if sometimes we also overestimate what can be done through media channels. I was just thinking about a visit I did to one of our programs in Uganda recently, where literally the girls that I was speaking to didn't have access to a mobile phone. I certainly didn't see a TV or a satellite TV anywhere. Maybe there might have been a radio in somebody's house. How are we really going to reach those girls through the public media?
I was just reflecting on what I was listening to, and I think we're hearing about 3 different things, actually, in the conversation. What we looked at was how the medium of media can be instrumental in addressing social norms and changing them, by and large. But we're also here talking about how media reflects a story, and thereby, through that process, may have an effect on wider society. And I think what I was hearing here as well was the wish that we could also look at less sensational issues and embed it more. And particularly in issues around sort of the wider community, which doesn't get so much coverage, but actually the whole issue of social movements and how people group together to make change is probably underreported, but who wants to talk about that? The Guardian is one thing. You will talk about things that most other newspapers that won't cover at all. So I think that's three different ways of thinking about
and this
what
idea
we're
of how
talking
you
about.
reach the poorest, are we overestimating, what could be done through the power of the media?
I'm not sure we are, except for, obviously coverage in terms of things like electricity and mobile phone coverage is patchy. But where it works, I think it's actually a really good medium, and I think that's what the research is finding, is that it is a very good medium with a lot of reach. So I think it's got a lot of potential.
I don't think we can generalise about that issue of access. It varies hugely from country to country. So in Bangladesh, you've got over 90% of girls having access to TV, and in Ethiopia, radio access amongst girls is tiny. And I think the concern is that we don't have up-to-date data, so we need to invest more in that. And when we do have data, it's just asking very simplistic questions around, have you watched TV in the last month? And actually that doesn't really give you enough information to programme around. So we need to understand more about how much time girls have got to engage with the media amongst all their other responsibilities. We have to know who's making the choices about what they watch, and that's just, lots of assumptions are made around that in project design, not really rooted in much evidence and data. So I certainly think if organisations working on girls' empowerment could come together and think about some of those sort of simple data gaps and work together to fill some of them. We've been talking to Girl Hub about that, how we can collate the data that we do have so that we're not reinventing the wheel when it comes to researching girls' access to media. I think that's really important.
I think reaching girls, for me, the important thing about that is that for girls to be able to reach information. But I think in terms of watching and consuming media in a more passive way, reaching the parents to change social norms is at least as important as reaching the girls, reaching the communities. It's not just a question of whether individual girls have access, it's whether the ether in which the people who are in control of them are breathing has different things in it, and that's where the media is really good. And I think that it's not just the issue of girls' access, it's the issue of what's everybody else consuming and what's it doing to them.
And just on the point about different channels for different people, Suki from the Global Campaign for Education in Washington, poor people in developing countries are still having problems accessing media like TV. We also need to think about how we can utilise radio too, very much going to what's the best platform. Some more questions from the audience. Over here.
Good evening. I'm Raphael from Maxwell Stamp. It's a London-based international development consultancy. My question regards the behavior change radio programs or soaps that you were talking about. I was wondering, in your experience and your research, are these initiatives mostly locally fueled and locally funded, or is it mostly donor-funded programs that lead to these kind of soaps or radio programs? And an underlying question to this is, what creates favorable environment in a country or in a community to have these kind of programs created and be, so we've seen how they can be more efficient, but that they actually exist and they're actually accepted and watched by people in the country.
Great. Some more questions? Or comments, indeed, on anything that you've heard? We also take comments. Yep, can go back.
Hello, this is Laura from Girls Not Brides again. I had a question, Caroline Sugg, for you. We talked a little bit about working with local media and helping them improve, building relationships with them. What are your thoughts on sort of training and workshops and roundtables with local media for local grassroots groups? I know a lot of Girls Not Brides members locally are thinking about how to do that well, but love to know your thoughts on their potential or not.
And just before we go to that, can I just quickly ask, I know just from looking through the list, there are a lot of people from NGOs in the audience. Have any of you actually done any media programs or experimented with media outreach, anything like that? Or, yep. Do you want to just share quickly your experience on that?
Hi, I'm JC. I work for a charity called Medical Aid Films. So we focus on producing content for training health workers in the sphere of maternal and child health. So it's slightly different to kind of things like Media Action and Girl Hub that's targeting girls directly. We're actually targeting health workers. It's obviously very relevant for us.
And how do you engage with the media? Is it that your films go up on
platforms?
So
we produce training and educational films. The films are open source content, so they're available to view and download from our website and via DVDs, USBs. We also integrate them into other organisations' training modules, so e-learning, for example, or mHealth apps. So really the way that we distribute our content is through partnerships. So we rely on organisations like UNICEF and JPIGO and AMREF to use our content to train people. So for example, in Somaliland, we're working to train midwives there to improve the health system. So we're not directly, doing mass media messaging. Rather, we're creating content for people to use for training.
And how do you know what works?
Lots of kind of testing. We have, unfortunately, our head of evaluation isn't here, so she goes through a rigorous process of gathering feedback and evaluation. I think we keep in touch, regularly with our kind of end users, from the big organisations to the kind of individual midwives and health workers in country, to find out kind of what works and what doesn't work. But a lot of our content is based on the training guidelines from WHO and so on.
Okay, great, thank you. So a couple of questions on over here. International funding versus local funding. Really interesting question, I think. And what creates a favourable environment? So I think panel members can chip in, but maybe start with Caroline.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a really hard one to answer. I think it varies hugely by context. I think in countries where there's a really strong culture of public service broadcasting, there are local media organisations producing some really powerful content for girls. They see girls as an important part of their constituency, and they are programming for them. But I do have to say that in the interviews that I did for this policy brief, most of the kind of large-scale dramas, long-running programmes were still being donor funded, and I think that's one of the questions that we have to grapple with together, is how can this programming be sustainable? Because if it's really only going to be broadcast for a couple of years at a time, what difference is it really going to make? Which is why I think then tackling some of those structural constraints are key, rather than keeping on churning out short-term media programmes. And just answer Laura's question while I can. It's interesting. I've been quite sceptical about the value of kind of short-term workshops and short-term engagements between media houses and NGOs. And at BBC Media Action, we tend to engage with our local media partners over periods of 2, 3, 4 years to bring about change over time. But you kindly put me in touch with lots of your local NGO partners, and lots of those that I spoke to were really convinced that some of the quite short-term workshops that they were doing with local media were really making a difference. So there's an example of an organisation called Bidari in Pakistan, who just were running some quite short-term engagements with local media, and really felt that those had led to shifts in the way that child marriage in particular was covered in the local newspaper and local newspapers, and felt that they could draw direct lines actually between that and some policy change. So I think some of those interviews that I did kind of challenge some of the assumptions that I'd had myself.
Rachel, do you want to just think what makes a favourable environment? Is obviously a big question.
Yeah, and quite a challenging one, because one of the clear findings from our review was that they really talked very little about the context and the environment. They focused somewhat on what makes a good media product, so on things like memorable storylines and that kind of thing, but very little around what else was needed to go with it. So now just kind of thinking more broadly about what makes social change happen and how can media tap into it. I mean, I'm thinking perhaps where there's the messages are kind of in tune with social change that's already starting to happen and attitudes that are already starting to happen. I think it can maybe catalyse that.
Eliza, maybe that's a point for you to chip in. You were talking very much about how the international celebrity-driven campaign might not be the sustainable one that delivers the change.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, I wrote towards a cracking storyline. Because essentially, if it's about what the media, especially if we're talking about radio programs or dramas, etc., I can't think of a single culture where there isn't some form of like storytelling. And so it's not first about the message, it's about actually, is this a really good story? Because I think organizations that lead, or if you lead with the message, or with the outcome, which is we need to stop violence against girls, and you neglect the story around it, no one is going to engage with it. And so it's really about, which is why, I think you were talking about EastEnders before, EastEnders, deplorable as it is, has a really good storyline. People keep coming back to it. And so I think people need to think first and foremost about that. Like, how do you build a story that resonates with a community, that they want to watch, talk, and share, and then embed into that messages, which then people can discuss afterwards. But that was just the one thing that I'd thought about when, you were asking.
Can I just say, I think it's often more of a case of finding what's already done. Every culture nowadays has these long running soaps that go on where they'd be desperately looking for new storylines. And I think your point about building the relationships, and one of the good things about having media trainings is you actually get to meet journalists, and therefore you can build relationships, and then you might be able to find the editor or something who might, and then you go, this is a really good story, this is what happened to me, and get it in, don't create new ones that we have to pay for, but put the storylines into the ones that are already running forever and ever and ever. And the same with, it happens with people who Bollywood films happen again, And I think that it's using what's there instead of recreating the wheel, and that is to do with building relationships and finding good stories, and not thinking, I think some of the stuff Plan's done, it's been partly co-funded. So the series that we did on female feticide was partly funded by Plan, but partly funded by the government as well, and some of the media partners. So it's a sort of, you can get those, but I do think if you can find a long-running soap and give them a good story, you're in a much better place.
Just a few comments from Twitter. It's doing well on Twitter, apparently, this event. Fascinating discussion. Important to bridge the gap between media actors and NGOs. Also, we need to inform girls of their rights and also potential. Maybe just a quick last round, if anyone's got burning comments or questions they want to ask.
Hi, I'm Grace Davis from BBC Media Action. I was interested in the point about commercial media and advertising and brands, and I suppose connected to that bigger question of sustainability and the fact that a lot of the work that we're doing has kind of limited timescales attached to it, and we're doing a lot to kind of support public service value kind of media, but who's going to be there long term with an interest in the kind of markets in which we're working is going to be the commercial media and the advertisers. And I think they've got a particular value around that wider sort of, the influencers as well as the girls that we're trying to reach. So I wonder if there's more that we can be thinking about how to work with them in a sophisticated way.
And I don't think that's happened yet in the global south as much as it could do. And I think that when I say that's a kind of clue to a potential strategy in the future, I think that there's a lot more we can be doing that. But obviously, then of course you need to have the data to hand to persuade the advertisers that of course you can be reaching. Well, exactly that. Clearly now, girls in the US have great spending power, which is why always are targeting them in that way. It's not going to be as simple in societies where girls just aren't an interesting audience for advertisers.
And there is the underlying issue of, especially if it's NGO-led, that the NGO still has a very sticky relationship with the private sector. And so, would rather avoid them wherever possible, and which isn't sustainable in the long run, because it's the private advertisers who are working in this space. And so finding a safe way of working, getting in bed with the private sector without, mucking the waters, because essentially they will be the ones who are there in the long haul, but partnering with the private sector.
I think what's worked really well with the work of the Gina Davis Institute in the States is that they've, it's a peer-to-peer relationship. It's not an NGO going to the head of Disney saying you should be caring more about gender equality. It's someone that the movie industry respects, and they're establishing that kind of peer-to-peer relationship. And I think that's not something I've seen happening elsewhere either. And I know that the Institute are looking at working in Nigeria now and in India, but thinking about, you know, which kind of local leaders within the media sector might take on that mantle in other societies. I think it's really
and
key.
I think
I don't think we're going to. I don't think it's going to be us in this room that's going to make that happen.
And I think Eliza's point is really relevant as well. It's to find the individuals within organisations who become the champions, and then to work with them long term. You had a question you wanted to ask the audience.
Well, it's just I just realised when I make this point, integrate for impact, and we're always saying that you know media for development should be integrating its work more with NGOs working on the ground, and that's not happening, and it's not happening to a great extent, and I just wondered what people thought or if people had good examples of that working well, or with kind of joint interventions being run, or if people had a sense of what some of the barriers to that might be. I mean, my sense is that one of the issues is an issue of scale. So when we work with donors as a media organisation, one of the things they're buying from us is massive scale and massive reach, whereas sort of working with sort of community-based work, you've got the depth, and sometimes when you try to put the two things together, the numbers look really strange, because we might be reaching 50 million people with a programme, and I don't know whether that's a barrier to it working better, or whether people can think of what some of the challenges to doing that better might be, because it's quite a glib thing to say, and there's probably reasons why it's not happening more. I don't know if people have
any reflections? Jess over there, and also Mark.
Just a really quick question about outside of the celebrities that are created through the dramas. Do you have any examples of ordinary celebrities, a bit like the YouTube phenomenon that happened here, that sort of encouraged girls to go for to do their own girl-led campaigns, or so do you have any examples in your...
Just before we come to that, maybe Mark, did you want to come back on Caroline's point?
Yeah, we struggled with that with our report on HIV. We found that one of the issues was people who are funding work, they wanted service delivery, because now there's a culture of measuring results and impact, and it's harder to measure results and impact with media. And then I also think it's changing the culture of NGOs. I've had lots of conversations with NGOs, and you find that they often think of media in terms of promoting themselves, as PR, if you like, and not like they'll have a health policy or an education policy. They won't have a media policy. It's kind of wrapped up. Well, you know all about that. So I think there's a challenge for the leadership of NGOs. So we need to go out there and get that message. I think the specialist organisations like BBC Media Action, I'm being very positive, but on a more negative note, you actually haven't been very good at building bridges with the mainstream development organisations. And they've been a bit sniffy about you and what you do, that somehow what they do is more important than what you do.
Yeah, that's not my I think that's changing quite a lot in our work. Changing. But I think there's still this issue about organisations doing very different kinds of work, and how you put those together as a whole intervention. Often it doesn't quite join up as much as. I mean, I'm out talking to mainstream NGOs all the time, and there's lots of kind of ideas about how we might work together, but actually I don't know whether it's that we're talking to different individuals within donor organisations. I don't know, but I think it's actually it's not hard to form the relationships, but often I think getting the funding to work together can be a challenge.
I think it is part. I think Mark is right that a lot of us promote ourselves, and one of the things I've always said about the girls' report, it's not about plan, it's about girls. So they can just back off, and on the whole, that's worked. But I think also that people are under stress, they're under budgeted, so actually going to somebody who's got either the power and the inclination to make it work, and then some level of funding to enable people to work together to produce something that's going to be worthwhile, I think that's really, really difficult. I mean, we had a sort of whole advisory panel structure around producing the girls' report, which was both good and bad, but it was trying to pull in so that we weren't working in isolation. And I think it's a really good idea, but it's finding the right person, but they've got to have the power and the money and the time, you know. And I think there is a lot of, I mean, I come from a media background, and I've been stunned by the amount of competition you get in the NGO environment, which is almost worse than any independent production company I've ever worked in. And I think there is an issue with that, about how to break down some of that stuff, and it partly is down to funding, I think. And people have targets, you know, about what they're supposed to be doing, and what you're doing may not always gel with them, and I think that's a big issue.
So, last question on the power of celebrity. Eliza, you talked briefly about trying to create the other Malalas. Did it work?
It was popular, wasn't it? So I was actually thinking that maybe someone needed to start something which is, you know, instead of, along with the website Everyday Sexism, we need an Everyday Girl Heroes site, where just, because essentially that then churns out and we find and we promote these other girls who in very small ways in different parts of the global south are doing something to just, you know, challenge the stereotype. I feel like someone needs to fund that.
There's a really good, sorry, have we finished?
No. Please.
No, I was just going to say there's a really good example in this policy briefing from an organisation in Colombia that's traditionally worked with mass media and drama, and they've found in their latest interventions that it's actually by bringing together some of the kind of YouTube celebrities that girls in Colombia respect, they've had a lot more impact, taking those girls, having them make their own videos, bringing YouTubers to schools. That's actually had a lot more impact with the girls they're trying to reach than their traditional kind of mass media stuff, or at least pairing the two's been really successful. So I think people are moving beyond those kind of traditional sort of top-down drama-based approaches and integrating it more with social media. I think that's a really impressive example.
So I said it was the last question, but this is the very last question.
Hi, I'm Bonnie. I started an organization called Lensational. It aims to empower women and girls through photography, and we work in Pakistan mainly, so equipping them with cameras. I was wondering what would be the next steps for the research report that you've published. Are you looking to for more examples to expand on the research and perhaps the geographical areas as well?
So
is that for me or for your research report?
Is it?
The research reports. So
Okay, both. So first of all,
I think for this report, I mean, really the next step for us is really just getting this conversation going, rather than, I mean, we're always interested in the kind learning about the work that's going on and maybe connecting people working in this area together. But I don't think the plans to produce more publications on this for us. It's really now about sparking a conversation and actually trying to change practice on the ground as a result of some of the recommendations. But yeah, we're really interested to know more about your work. So, you want to?
Well, I think there is a drive at the moment for demonstrating impact, and that has been going on for a couple of years. I don't see it going away, and I think we actually don't really know the impact. Whether we ever can, of course, is a big question, particularly in some of these less easy to measure areas. I mean, measuring the impact of media is difficult. Measuring, you know, girls' empowerment is incredibly difficult. But I think there will be a demand for knowing what's worked, what works. And one of the difficulties we've faced is that because the 20 examples that Rachel talked about were part of a bigger study, of which I think there were 68 projects that we looked at, looking at all different forms of communication. And that came from, how many was it?
Over 500.
Over 500 projects that we started with, and we dropped a lot of them because they weren't very rigorous at all, and we couldn't really judge whether they had an impact or not. So I think the drive is going to be there for more impact, for knowing what works, for disaggregating it more, and for people working in media to measure more precisely what they're doing and whether it has an impact. Because although people say, oh yes, we look at it and we think it's had an impact, actually you've got to write down very rigorously why you think that's the case and what evidence you're bringing to bear on that. So I think that will be a growing trend.
So just on that note, I would just like to say thank you very much to the panel for this incredibly rich discussion. Thank you very much if you joined online. Thank you very much if you struggled through the cold to come here. You know, it's been a discussion that's ranged from talking about impact, you know, the evidence seems to show that there has been a positive experience with media empowering girls, but we need more evidence of impact. We've talked a little bit about how we need to build the bridges between media houses or those engaged with media projects and NGOs. We've talked a lot about working locally versus actually the big global picture of global campaigns, but the power of local media, but needing to find the right people to bring about the change. And actually we talked about some of those experiences in the north, the successes in the north of bringing in the commercial sector. Could we replicate that in the south? And so very rich topics. I'm sure you will take some of that outside and continue discussing. I think there are nibbles outside, I have been told to say. But I just want to say thanks very much to BBC Media Action and also the social development team here at ODI for organising this event. And thanks again to the panel for such great contributions. Thank you. Thank you.